On Memorial Day weekend, May 25, 1980, a team of cavers from the Mother Lode Grotto set out to explore Church Cave in Kings Canyon National Park, California. The group, consisting of Dave Cowan, Paul Graves, Jack Espina, Bob Pine, and Erik Popoff, was looking forward to an adventurous but controlled journey into the depths of one of the park's most famous caves. Excitement buzzed as they packed their gear, checked their ropes, and reviewed the route they'd take to reach Church Cave, a steep and winding path through the dense, rugged canyon. The morning was clear as they began their trek from Boyden Cave's parking lot, weaving their way up through trails thick with pine trees and the sounds of birds. They moved in single file along the narrow dirt path, carefully stepping over roots and jagged stones. Each member was experienced, but they all knew the risks. They joked to ease the tension, laughing off the idea of natural disasters or cave-ins. But as they approached the mouth of Church Cave around 9:30 a.m., fate threw them a grim reminder of the forces that lie hidden beneath the Earth's surface. The team cautiously descended into the cave, one by one. They rappelled down into the depths, feeling the damp, cool air. They made their way in the depths, and walls closed in tighter the deeper they went, until they reached a small chamber barely big enough to accommodate them all. It was a still room where shadows seemed to breathe, and every sound echoed off the stone. They took a moment to gather themselves, checking their gear and catching their breath. Suddenly, a deep rumble shook the ground beneath them, and the group halted, exchanging nervous glances. Before they could react, the ground lurched. It was an earthquake, a powerful 6.0 quake that threw the men off balance. The cave jolted violently, nearly throwing them off their feet as they scrambled to hold onto the rock walls. Dust and tiny stones rained down from above, and the oppressive weight of the earth seemed to press down on them all at once. When the shaking stopped, they took a collective sigh, shaken but safe. "Maybe that's a sign we should turn back," one of them said nervously. But by then they were way too deep inside. The jolting was huge, and at any moment it can happen again. Chances of getting into a diresome predicament were high. The cave could collapse any moment. They needed to get out fast. Barely 20 minutes later, as they approached the mouth of the cave, another tremor hit. This one a 5.7 on Richter scale. The ground swayed and groaned, and small rocks began tumbling down the canyon slopes around them. The group huddled close, crouching low to avoid being struck by any debris. The quake subsided again. They weren't hurt this time either, but they knew things can get worse anytime. By 12:45 p.m., they had reached an infamous section known as the torture chamber. Here, the cave's narrow walls pressed in on them, forcing them to navigate tight squeezes. They had previously climbed down from here, but now they had to hurriedly climb up the steep chute. Jack Espina was the first to start up the steep wall, moving slowly and methodically as his friends waited for their turn. Below him, Popoff was at the base of a 30-foot chimney. Bob, followed behind, carefully tested each step. Just as they were settling into this cramped space, the unthinkable happened. A violent, bone-rattling 6.0 quake struck directly again. The entire cave erupted in movement. Jack lost his grip and slid downward, his body slamming into the rock as he tumbled down the narrow chute. He came to a sudden halt, wedged tightly between two boulders in a narrow crevice, unable to move. His cries echoed through the chamber as he struggled to free himself, panic taking over as the rumbling continued. Pebbles and dirt cascaded down around him. Below him, the rest of the team was scrambling for footing as the quake continued to shake the cave. "Jack, hold on!" shouted Cowan, who was gripping the wall with all his strength. Jack could only scream in reply, his body locked in the suffocating grip of the rock walls around him. When the quake finally subsided, the men took a moment to catch their breath, their faces pale, and their hands shaking. Jack's voice came in shallow, panicked gasps as he tried to control his fear. With coordinated efforts and the support of a few ropes, the group managed to free him, pulling him out of the crevice where he'd been wedged. Visibly shaken, Jack pushed on with the rest of them, determined to leave the cave. But as they crawled back up through a narrow passage toward the entrance, the earth began to tremble once more. This time, the tremors jolted them violently in every direction, It was complete chaos. Bob was thrown sideways into the jagged wall. Cowan, too, was battered, his shoulder hitting hard against a jutting rock. "Just keep moving," Popoff urged. The situation was no less than a nightmare. Every time they thought the shaking had stopped, another aftershock would rumble through the cave, causing them to freeze in place, fearing the walls around them might finally give in and collapse. They pressed their bodies low, hugging the cold rock, desperate to avoid being caught in a rock slide. Finally, they saw the faint glow of daylight up ahead. The team staggered toward the entrance, their bodies battered, their clothing torn, and their faces streaked with dirt and blood. Just as they reached the cave's mouth, one last aftershock hit, a 5.7 that shook the ground beneath them, causing a final cascade of pebbles and dust. They stumbled out into the sunlight, each man bearing the marks of their harrowing journey, bruises, cuts, and swollen limbs. Exhausted and traumatized, they took a moment to let the sunlight wash over them, grateful to be alive. Despite the strength of the quake and the constant danger, Church Cave had somehow withstood the tremors without collapse. Though they had survived, the memory of that day would stay with them forever. On the cool morning of March 23, 2004, Jesus Chawaria Manriquez, 34, was enjoying an outing with his family and friends at Crystal Ball Cave near Gandy, Utah. The day was perfect for relaxation, and the highlight of the trip was the nearby Warm Creek Springs, a popular swimming spot fed by a spring from a lesser-known cave ominously named Beware Cave. The atmosphere was lighthearted as they splashed in the warm waters, but Manriquez, with an adventurous spirit, noticed the dark mouth of Beware Cave feeding the spring. Driven by curiosity, he decided to explore it on his own. The cave was shrouded in mystery, and though not as famous as the commercial Crystal Ball Cave, it drew the attention of those seeking something more. Manriquez entered the cave alone, disappearing briefly into its depths. When he re-emerged, excitement filled his voice. He urged his friends to follow him inside, eager to show them what lay beyond the water. They hesitated at first, but with his infectious enthusiasm, some agreed to explore the entrance of the cave. Once inside, the group marveled at the cave's rocky passageways. Manriquez, always eager to take home a piece of his adventure, encouraged them to collect some rocks from inside. While the others made their way back to the surface with their handfuls, Manriquez lingered in the shadows, determined to find more. He ventured deeper, beyond where anyone else had dared to go. Minutes turned into longer stretches of time, and Manriquez still hadn't returned. His family and friends, waiting near the pool, grew anxious. They called out for him, their voices echoing in the cave, but there was no reply. Panic began to creep in. It wasn't like Manriquez to stay silent for so long. When he still didn't return, they rushed to alert the cave's managers and asked for help. Rescue teams were quickly dispatched to the scene. They entered the cave with urgency, knowing that every second counted. The passage was filled with 3 to 4 feet of water, but there was typically enough breathing space above the surface to navigate safely, at least in the early part of the cave. However, about 10 feet in, the way was blocked by a veil of stalactites. The rescuers realized that to continue, they would have to submerge themselves beneath the cold water. It was behind these stalactites that they found Manriquez. He had attempted to pass through the narrow submerged section, but had become trapped by the force of the water. His body was wedged tightly in the passage, a silent testament to the power of the cave. It was obvious that as he tried to navigate past a veil of stalactites, the force of the water pushed him into a tight space. His body, caught between jagged rock formations, became wedged in a way that left him completely trapped. The current pressed him deeper into the constriction, pinning his torso while his legs remained partially submerged. The narrow passage left little room to maneuver, and with each struggle, the surrounding rocks dug into his skin, making escape impossible. His attempts to free himself only wedged him tighter, as the relentless water and unforgiving walls sealed his fate. Despite the best efforts of the rescuers, it was clear that he had drowned, likely after being unable to free himself from the dangerous current that surged through the narrow tunnel. Rescuers brought in a winch system to carefully free Manriquez's body, as pulling by hand had failed. Divers positioned themselves in the narrow, water-filled passage, securing ropes around his body without worsening his position. Slowly, the winch was engaged, inching him free despite the water's pressure. After a long, delicate work, they finally extracted him, though they knew he had drowned long before. The sharp stalactites and flowing water made the process both dangerous and exhausting. The cave's dark beauty had turned deadly in an instant. For Manriquez, an afternoon of exploration had become a final, tragic adventure. His family, still in shock, would forever remember the day not for its laughter, but for the loss of a beloved father, son, and friend. On Saturday, February 22, 1975, a tragic event unfolded in the depths of Salamander Cave, located near Bloomington, Indiana. Heavy rains and rising waters turned what was supposed to be an afternoon of exploration into a nightmare for 3 university freshmen, Kim Allen Aldrich, Marcia Ann Bott, and Terry Lee Yoakum, none of whom could have imagined the life-threatening danger they were walking into. It had been raining for days, saturating the ground in the region. Salamander Cave, a popular spot for beginner cavers, became treacherous as the rainwater began flooding the passages inside. A stream that usually flowed gently through the cave was now surging rapidly, threatening to fill the cave with water. Despite warnings from more experienced cavers, the 3 freshmen, led by Aldrich, ventured into the cave just after 1 p.m. Aldrich had some previous caving experience, but neither Bott nor Yoakum had any, and none were members of any organized caving group. Aldrich and Yoakum had hard hats and carbide lamps, while Bott carried only a large flashlight. Unfortunately, none of them were prepared for the deadly combination of rising water and narrow, dark tunnels. At the entrance, they were met by a group led by John Abney, who was leaving the cave due to the rising water. He warned them of the danger, urging them to turn back, but the 3 freshmen ignored the warning and pressed on. A second warning came from Kathy Hoey, a graduate student studying aquatic life in the cave. She had entered earlier that morning but decided to leave when the water began to rise to boot-top level. Hoey later warned another group, who wisely exited the cave shortly after seeing the situation for themselves. Despite the warnings, Aldrich, Bott, and Yoakum continued deeper into Salamander Cave, unaware of the disaster that was about to strike. Despite their efforts, it became clear that the floodwaters were coming in too fast. The cave, which had once seemed like an adventure, had turned into a death trap. By the time they realized the severity of their situation, it was likely too late. Since the storm outside intensified, heavy downpours hit the area, causing the water in the cave to rise more rapidly. By 8:15 p.m., Michael Moore and Jim Keith, called by the Indiana State Police, arrived at the cave to check on the situation. They found only 18 inches of airspace left at the entrance passage. The cave was rapidly filling with water, leaving very little room for anyone to escape. By 10:10 p.m., Moore, Keith, and another caver, Don Paquette, returned to Salamander Cave to search for the missing students. Muddy footprints marked the cave floor, showing where they had tried to navigate the rising waters. Scratches on rocks near the entrance suggested they had clung to the slippery cave walls, fighting against the surging water. One of their carbide lamps had been dropped, barely flickering, signaling the panic that had begun to take hold. Even a half-eaten snack was found on a ledge, perhaps from a brief moment when they had stopped, trying to regroup or figure out how to escape. If the trio waited in the large passages of Breakdown Mountain, they might have survived the flood. But the group perhaps decided to press on. In fact, the water rose so high that there was only about an inch of airspace remaining near the ceiling of an 8-foot-high section of the cave, but this would not have been enough for a human to survive. The narrow passage that once seemed navigable had transformed into a death trap. Traces indicated Aldrich, Bott, and Yoakum likely struggled desperately to stay above the water, pressing against the ceiling, fighting for every breath. But as the airspace diminished, their chances of survival vanished. Trapped with no way out, the rising flood overwhelmed them and they were found drowned. Just a short distance from the cave's entrance, their struggle lost to the relentless floodwaters. Less than 100 feet into the entrance passage, they made a grim discovery. Kim Aldrich and Marcia Bott had drowned. Their bodies were found lying in the water, trapped by the rising floodwaters. Despite the devastation, Terry Yoakum was still missing, and the rescuers hoped he had managed to escape to a higher spot deeper in the cave, possibly at Breakdown Mountain. The cave's layout added to the peril. About 500 feet from the entrance was Breakdown Mountain, a massive 30-foot-high passage known as a potential refuge during floods. Beyond it, the stream passage rose, but the floodwaters that day were relentless. The rescuers believed that if Yoakum had made it past the final turn in the entrance passage, he might have survived by taking shelter in one of the higher spots upstream. However, with the rain still pouring and the water continuing to rise, the rescuers were forced to leave the cave without recovering the bodies. They notified authorities, but the ongoing flooding made any further search attempts impossible until the next morning. By the time rescuers re-entered the cave after 8 a.m. the following day, it was too late. Terry Yoakum's body was found a short distance from his companions. The tragedy could be traced back to several factors: lack of preparation, poor judgment, and ultimately panic. The freshmen had entered the cave without proper gear or knowledge of caving in flood-prone environments. They had ignored multiple warnings and, as the water levels rose, likely became frightened and attempted to flee. But it was too late. The caving community was left shaken by the loss. In their post-mortem analysis, they stressed the importance of proper preparation, knowledge, and caution when exploring caves, especially during periods of heavy rainfall. Mark, Jason, and Luke had been planning their weekend caving trip for months. Their destination was the infamous Grim Reaper Cave, a labyrinthine network of passages and chambers renowned for its treacherous terrain and unsettling sounds. Local stories spoke of narrow tunnels, hidden crevices, and eerie echoes that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. Despite the ominous warnings, the group entered the cave poorly prepared. They had only basic flashlights to light their way, and their clothing, jeans, thin jackets, and sneakers, was woefully inadequate for the cave's unforgiving environment. Mark brought a worn-out rope, its fibers weakened by time and wear, while Jason packed a single bottle of water, grossly underestimating the expedition's duration. As they crawled deeper into the cave's depths, the tunnels became increasingly tighter. Mark's concern grew exponentially as he realized the path ahead was treacherously constricted, the sharp edges of the rocks threatening to scrape and snag at their bodies. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and mold. Disaster struck mere minutes later. Mark slipped, wedging himself between two jagged boulders. His body was squeezed so tightly that escape seemed impossible. Jason, trapped behind him, found his arm pinned beneath Mark's body, the weight of his friend's torso threatening to crush his limb. Panic began to set in. Luke, the last in line, realized the severity of their situation. He tried his best to free up Jason, but his efforts went futile. If only he could reach and rescue Mark, the situation might turn into their favor. However, with Jason stuck just behind Mark, things seemed difficult. The air was growing thinner, and the damp chill of the cave was seeping into their bones, hypothermia looming over them. He could feel the air quality diminishing as the tunnel became more oppressive. The stakes were clear. If he didn't act quickly, Mark could suffocate. Jason would lose his composure, and they all could succumb to the conditions. Recognizing the desperate need for external aid, he reluctantly left his friends, embarking on the arduous journey back to the surface. The darkness seemed to close in around him as he navigated the winding tunnels. Breathless and frantic, Luke reached the surface, hastily alerting the local search and rescue team to the crisis unfolding beneath their feet. Within the hour, a specialized cave rescue unit arrived, equipped with an array of advanced tools designed specifically for such perilous extractions. The team swiftly deployed a portable monitoring device, confirming their worst fears. Oxygen levels had plummeted, while carbon dioxide concentrations had spiked to hazardous levels. To combat this, they rapidly prepared a lightweight oxygen delivery system designed to sustain the trapped men until rescue. Led by seasoned rescuers, the team descended into the cave, navigating the treacherous terrain with caution. Armed with rock drills, carbide-tipped chisels, and inflatable air bladders, their challenge was to widen the crevice without compromising the cave's fragile structural integrity. Mark's situation was precarious in the extreme, his chest compressed by the rocks to the point where breathing had become a torturous struggle. The medics knew they had to act with haste to prevent catastrophic internal injuries. Jason, pinned beneath Mark, faced severe circulation issues, his arm numb and pale. The rescuers prioritized Jason's freedom, carefully positioning a rescue harness around his torso. Utilizing a mechanical advantage pulley system, they painstakingly pulled him backward, guiding his feet to find small footholds in the uneven terrain. Once Jason was freed, the team focused on extracting Mark. They inserted an air bladder, gradually inflating it to create sufficient space between Mark's body and the rock. Applying steady tension, they inched him out, finally pulling him free, battered, bruised, and bloodied, yet alive. Medics swiftly attended to the men's conditions, administering treatment for hypothermia and severe dehydration. Mark and Jason owed their lives to the rescue team's expertise, technology, and selfless bravery. As they emerged from the cave, blinking in the bright sunlight, the trio realized the gravity of their mistake. They vowed never to underestimate the power of nature again, grateful for a second chance. It was a bitter winter morning on February 27, 2004, as the frost clung stubbornly to the Kentucky hills. A group of eager Boy Scouts gathered at the mouth of Sweet Potato Cave, their breaths visible in the cold air. Among the scouts was Jesse Gott, a 14-year-old who was no stranger to adventure. The excitement of the day was palpable as they prepared for the caving expedition, the thrill of exploration burning through the icy chill. Sweet Potato Cave, tucked away in the rural landscape of Kentucky, was both a wonder and a challenge. Surrounded by rolling hills and dense woodlands, the cave was part of an intricate network of limestone formations, carved over thousands of years by underground streams. Its entrance, small and unassuming, lay hidden among the trees, as if guarding the secrets within. The narrow passageways twisted and turned, leading deep into the earth, with crevices so tight that even the most experienced divers had to tread cautiously. But for this group of scouts, the cave was familiar territory. They had visited before and knew its winding paths well enough to feel confident. With helmets and headlamps securely fastened, they plunged into the darkness, their laughter echoing off the cool, damp walls as they navigated through the initial passages. Everything seemed to be going smoothly until they stumbled upon a narrow crevice deeper inside the cave. It was a tight squeeze, far narrower than any passage they had encountered that day, but Jesse's curiosity got the better of him. The scouts' leaders, including Andrew Duncan, cautioned him to stay back, warning him that it could be dangerous. But Jesse was determined to see what lay on the other side. He had always been the kind of boy who pushed limits, unwilling to settle for anything less than extraordinary. Ignoring the warnings, Jesse wedged himself into the crevice. At first, it was exhilarating. The thought of discovering something unseen by his friends made his heart race with excitement. But that excitement quickly turned to panic as the walls of the crevice closed in around him. He could no longer move forward or backward. His chest was tightly wedged between the rock walls, and no amount of effort could free him. The more he struggled, the more the cave seemed to tighten its grip on him. Panic rose within him as memories of other cavers getting stuck in similarly terrifying situations flooded his mind. He had heard those stories, but like many, he had never believed it could happen to him. Until now. Andrew Duncan, noticing Jesse's distress, rushed to his side. Andrew would later recount. Jesse's face was a mask of fear, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. The excitement that had once filled the air was replaced by an eerie silence as the other scouts gathered around, unsure of what to do. Some of the younger scouts murmured words of encouragement, their voices trembling with worry. As the minutes passed, Jesse's panic deepened. His chest tightened, not just from the physical pressure of the cave walls, but from the overwhelming fear that he might not get out. He tried to calm himself, focusing on his breathing, but it was nearly impossible. The darkness of the cave, once a thrilling adventure, now seemed to press in on him from all sides. Andrew and a few other scouts stayed with Jesse, trying to reassure him while some of the others ran back toward the entrance to call for help. Jesse's mind raced as he tried to control the mounting fear. His hands were growing numb from the cold and his body was beginning to tremble. No one had noticed yet, but hypothermia was starting to set in. The biting cold of the cave, combined with the inability to move, was taking its toll on him. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours as Jesse remained wedged in the narrow crevice. Andrew and the other scouts did their best to comfort him, but there was little they could do. The helplessness of the situation weighed heavily on them all. Meanwhile, the call for help had reached the local firefighters and rescue squad. The urgency of the situation prompted a swift response, and within a short time, a rescue team was assembled and on its way to the cave. These were seasoned rescuers trained for such emergencies, but they knew that time was critical. Every minute Jesse spent trapped in the cold, narrow crevice increased the risk to his life. When the rescuers finally arrived, they quickly made their way into the cave, their hearts heavy with the weight of the task ahead. The sight of Jesse trapped in the darkness, his body wedged tightly between the unforgiving rock walls, tugged at their emotions. He needed medical attention immediately, not just for his injuries, but also to combat the hypothermia that was quickly setting in. They wasted no time wrapping Jesse in blankets and heating pads, trying to warm his body as they formulated a plan to free him. Using shovels and crowbars, they began to work on widening the narrow passage. The sound of metal scraping against stone filled the cave, each clink a reminder that the clock was ticking. Jesse tried to stay calm as the rescuers worked tirelessly. He could hear the muffled voices of his friends and the rescuers, but everything felt distant. His body was cold, his fingers numb, but he clung to the hope that soon he would be free. The hours stretched on, but finally, there was a breakthrough. The rescuers managed to widen the crevice enough to begin pulling Jesse free. With a collective effort, they carefully maneuvered him out of the crack. The moment Jesse was freed, a wave of relief washed over everyone. Cheers echoed through the cave, and the scouts, who had been holding their breath for hours, finally exhaled in unison. Jesse was immediately carried out of the cave and taken to a local hospital, where doctors were waiting to assess his condition. Though the ordeal had left him with mild hypothermia, the medical team worked quickly to warm him and monitor his recovery. Miraculously, despite the cold and the fear, Jesse had made it through the ordeal with only minor physical harm. As the sun began to set that evening, Jesse was discharged from the hospital. The events of the day had left a lasting impression on him and his fellow scouts. It was a day none of them would ever forget. A day of fear, courage, and ultimately, survival. In January 1970, a group of 31 adventurers from Massachusetts, including both seasoned and novice cavers, set off to explore Knox Cave, a well-known caving spot near Knox, New York. Excitement buzzed through the group as they hiked through the snow to the cave's entrance, hidden in a snow-filled sinkhole. The cave had once been a commercial attraction, but now it was a place for daring explorers who were ready to face its challenges. Knox Cave, with its twisting passages and hidden chambers, was known to be challenging, yet it had long drawn thrill seekers. The group had heard stories about the cave's wild sections, accessible only through a notoriously tight passage known as the gun barrel, a keyhole-shaped crawl barely 18 inches in diameter and 60 feet long. Those who passed through the gun barrel could explore the untouched parts of the cave, and that was where most of the group was headed. For many, this was the ultimate test of bravery. Squeezing through such a tight space required not only physical effort, but also mental strength. As the group made their way inside the cold, dark cave, 19 of them decided to tackle the gun barrel. Among them was 14-year-old Peter Viennes, a first-time caver who was eager to prove himself. Crawling through the tight space was no easy task, but the group pressed on, one by one. Peter, however, was near the end of the line. When Peter reached the narrow gun barrel passage, he hesitated. This was the tightest space he had ever seen, more like a tunnel meant for smaller animals than for a human. Taking a deep breath, he squeezed into the small opening. Inch by inch, he dragged himself forward, his body scraping against the rough rock walls. As he was just 8 feet from exiting the passage, disaster struck. His knee slipped into a narrow floor crevice and got wedged tight. He tried to pull it free, but the more he struggled, the more it seemed to get stuck. Panic began to creep in as he twisted his leg, trying desperately to loosen it. His body was wedged in such a way that movement was limited, and every attempt to free himself only caused pain. His breathing grew shallow, his chest constricted by the tight walls of the passage. At first, the group ahead of him were unaware of what had happened. All 18 of them pressed on. Peter cried in pain, and one by one, they began to realize that something was wrong. They called out to him. Peter responded, his voice strained as he explained his predicament. The group soon realized they were stuck along with him as they couldn't get out without Peter getting free first. They quickly tried to free him by pulling and shifting his leg, but nothing worked. Peter was in pain, and the more they tried to help, the more distressed he became. As the minutes dragged on, the temperature in the cave began to drop. The cave's natural chill, combined with their inability to move, made hypothermia a very real threat, not for just Peter, but all the other 18 members stuck inside. People waiting outside began to grow anxious as more than 2 hours passed with no sign of the first group returning from inside the cave. Worried, one of them decided to go in and check. To his shock, he discovered that the entire group was trapped, with Peter wedged in the gun barrel, blocking the passage. Without wasting time, he rushed out to inform the others. Soon, everyone was inside trying to help Peter, but their efforts only made things worse. Every attempt to move him caused Peter unbearable pain, and they were forced to stop. Ahead of him, the group was growing increasingly anxious. Some were beginning to panic, the confined space making it difficult to calm their nerves. Some of the younger members of the group began to cry quietly, while the older cavers tried to keep everyone calm. With no way to get him out, they had no other option but to call for help. It was 1:30 p.m. when Peter became stuck, and as the hours passed, the situation became more dire for everyone. Soon, police officers and firefighters arrived at the scene, but when they saw the narrow gun barrel and Peter's wedged knee, they realized this was no ordinary rescue. They first tried using a collapsible pike pole to lift Peter's leg, but his cries of pain stopped them in their tracks. At one point, Peter, terrified and exhausted, started screaming that a snake was biting him, though there was no snake, just his mind playing tricks on him in the fear and confusion. After several failed attempts, the rescuers realized brute force wouldn't work. They needed a different approach. 7 hours passed, and the cold was becoming unbearable. If they weren't freed soon, the low temperatures in the cave could lead to dangerous exposure. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., the rescuers came up with a solution. One member handed down a thermos of soapy water to lubricate Peter's knee and loosen its grip on the crevice. The firefighters then carefully tied a rope around Peter's ankle, but instead of pulling wildly, they coordinated their movements with the people inside the cave. Gently, they began pulling Peter's leg toward his head, while those inside wriggled alongside him, keeping pressure off his knee. Slowly but surely, his knee began to shift, and with one final effort, it popped free from the crevice. The relief was palpable, but the rescuers didn't celebrate just yet. They knew that if they pulled too hard, Peter could slip back into the slot. Carefully, they guided him the rest of the way out, making sure he was completely clear of the tight passage. Finally, after 7 long hours, Peter was free. The 18 cavers behind him could now crawl out to safety, and the threat of hypothermia or further injury had passed. Though exhausted and shaken, Peter and the rest of the group emerged from the cave into the cold night air, grateful to be out of the darkness. What had started as an adventurous day had turned into a rescue mission, but thanks to quick thinking and teamwork, everyone made it out unharmed. On February 12, 2022, John Young and Marvin Miller set out to explore a newly discovered cave in Texas, eager for adventure and the thrill of the unknown. The cave had just been uncovered, with its narrow passages and deep pits presenting a real challenge for the duo. As they descended into the dark, cool cave, the excitement of the unknown spurred them forward. After a 10-foot down climb, they reached a belly crawl, squeezing through several tight fissures that eventually opened into a larger room. Young, always up for a challenge, took on the most difficult part, a 4-foot deep fissure leading to a small room at the edge of a larger pit. He navigated the tight slot, feeling the thrill of discovery as he reached the other side. But the excitement soon turned to frustration. When it was time to return, Young realized he couldn't climb back up through the narrow fissure. The constriction was too tight, and no matter how hard he pushed, he couldn't find the leverage to pull himself through. Trapped with no way to move, panic began to creep in. John Young was trapped from below, his gut, groin, and waist caught in the unforgiving grip of the narrow fissure. The rock squeezed his lower body like a vice, pressing into his abdomen with brutal force. He could feel the weight of the cave crushing him from the bottom, making it impossible to move his legs. The pressure around his groin was unbearable, sending sharp waves of pain shooting up through his body every time he tried to shift. His waist was wedged so tightly that every breath felt like a battle. His stomach compressed against the hard stone. The pain radiated through his core, and with each failed attempt to push himself free, the rocks seemed to close in tighter. It was as if the cave was swallowing him whole, slowly squeezing the life out of him from the waist down. Miller, sensing the urgency, quickly left the cave to retrieve tools, a hammer, chisel, rope, and other gear. He returned and tried to widen the tight shaft himself, chiseling at the rock in an attempt to free his friend. But despite his best efforts, it wasn't enough. The passage was too narrow, and the clock was ticking. Realizing they needed more help, Miller made the tough decision to leave the cave once more, this time to call for professional assistance. Soon, a rescue crew arrived, including Kurt Menking, Bennett Lee, Greg Mosier, Joe Ranzow, Angela Young, Lisa Miller, Matt Saltz, and the local EMS fire and rescue teams. Together, they devised a plan to free Young from his rocky prison. They began by carefully chiseling away at the rock around John's waist and hips, widening the fissure inch by inch. The tension in the air was thick, as each hammer strike had to be precise. One wrong move could cause the rocks to shift unpredictably. The team set up a pulley system to help lift him out once the space was wide enough. They also brought in a pile of rocks, which they placed beneath John's feet to give him some much-needed leverage. As they worked, John remained calm, though the pressure on his lower body was immense. His muscles ached, and the constant squeezing of his waist and gut was agonizing. Every time he tried to push himself upward, the rock seemed to fight back, holding him down. But with the extra support of the rocks beneath his feet, he finally had a foothold. Slowly, with the rescuers pulling from above, and John pushing with every ounce of strength he had left, he managed to rise up. After hours of effort, John was finally able to wriggle free from the grip of the cave. This close call was a reminder of how unpredictable cave exploration can be and how even the most seasoned adventurers must stay prepared. For Young and Miller, their day of exploration had turned into a test of endurance and teamwork, and they emerged with a story of resilience and survival. However, in the next story, the spelunkers weren't that lucky. They were warned by many, but they still went on to play with their lives. It was Saturday, June 23rd, 2018. The boys of the Wild Boars Football Club were excited for another day of training. The team, made up of 12 boys between the ages of 11 and 16, was led by their assistant coach, Ekapol Chantawong, while the head coach was busy preparing for a game with the senior team. The head coach said his goodbyes after practice, expecting the boys to head home soon. But a few hours later, the coach noticed something strange. His phone was filled with missed calls from the boys' parents. They were calling because the boys had never returned home. Their families were growing more anxious by the minute. With every unanswered phone call, dread crept in. The coach tried to reach the assistant coach and the other boys, but his calls went straight to voicemail. Panic set in. Finally, he managed to reach one player, Sangpol, a 13-year-old boy who had been picked up by his mother after practice. Sangpol explained that the rest of the team had planned to visit the nearby Tamluang caves for a quick exploration. The coach felt his heart sink. He knew how dangerous those caves could be, especially during the monsoon season. Without wasting a moment, he jumped into his car and rushed to the caves. When he arrived at the cave entrance, he found the boys' bicycles, backpacks, and shoes, abandoned and covered in mud. The sight was terrifying. The boys were still inside, but the entrance to the cave was now flooded with water. Heavy rains, which had started while the boys were in the cave, had already made the cave entrance impassable. The boys were trapped inside the cave system, and it was now a race against time. The coach immediately called for help. Thai authorities and local police rushed to the scene. As they arrived, they realized that the water level inside the cave was rising rapidly. Initial efforts to enter the cave and search for the boys were futile. The floodwaters were too strong. The team's parents arrived, frantic, their worst fears seemingly confirmed. The boys were trapped, and there was no easy way to reach them. Authorities soon realized they needed expert help, and they called in the Thai Navy SEALs, known for their elite training in diving and rescue operations. But the Navy SEALs were not specialized in cave diving, and Tam Luang was one of the most dangerous cave systems in Thailand, spanning over 10 kilometers, with narrow passageways, deep chambers, and treacherous currents. The monsoon rains had created a deadly scenario. A local British expat, Vernon Unsworth, who had been exploring the cave for years, heard the news and offered his assistance. His knowledge of the cave system was invaluable, and he quickly connected Thai authorities with the British Cave Rescue Council. Two of the world's best cave divers, John Valanthan and Rick Stanton, were soon on their way to Thailand. These men, though not military trained, were cave diving legends with decades of experience navigating the darkest, most dangerous underwater caves on Earth. The stakes were growing higher by the day. As the days passed, people feared the worst. The boys had only planned for a short trip into the cave, meaning they likely had little to no food, and the oxygen levels inside the cave were decreasing rapidly due to the floodwaters. For the British divers, arriving in Thailand presented a challenge. Not only did they have to navigate through a complex flooded cave system, but they had to contend with skepticism from Thai authorities. Why would civilian divers from another country be more capable than the elite Thai Navy SEALs? The truth was, while the Navy SEALs were incredibly skilled, cave diving required a very specific set of skills, and John and Rick were among the best in the world. When they finally entered the cave, the conditions were worse than they had imagined. Visibility was close to zero, so bad that they had to feel their way along the cave walls. The current was strong, pushing them back as they tried to advance. Using ropes and lines, they began setting up a guideline system, essential for any divers to make it safely through the cave. Each dive into the cave was grueling, with Rick and John having to physically pull themselves along the floor to avoid being swept away by the current. Their first target was Pattaya Beach, a high-elevation chamber deep inside the cave where the boys might have sought refuge from the rising waters. But after hours of exhausting effort, they reached Pattaya Beach only to find it empty. The boys were not there. The situation was becoming increasingly dire. Heavy rains continued to fall, and the water levels inside the cave rose higher, making it even more difficult to advance. However, Rick and John decided to press further into the cave despite the risks. They had already used up much of their air supply, but their instincts told them to keep going. They swam past Pattaya Beach deeper into the cave. Suddenly, out of the darkness, they spotted something, a faint light ahead. As they swam closer, they could hear voices. John Valanthan turned on his camera and shone his light on the figures in the distance. It was the boys. All 12 boys and their assistant coach were huddled together on a narrow rock ledge, alive but weak. They had been trapped in the cave for 10 long days. The discovery was a miracle. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. But the hardest part was yet to come. Getting the boys out of the cave was going to be a monumental task. The cave passages were narrow and treacherous, and the boys were weak, dehydrated, and some were too young to swim. As the Thai Navy SEALs and British divers deliberated on how to proceed, a tragic event struck. Saman Kunan, a former Thai Navy SEAL who had volunteered for the mission, tragically lost his life while placing air tanks along the cave system. His death was a painful reminder of just how dangerous the rescue operation was. They were trapped approximately 4 kilometers inside Tham Luang Cave, nestled in the mountainous region of northern Thailand. The heavy monsoon rains had flooded the cave system, blocking their exit and creating treacherous conditions that posed immense challenges for rescue efforts. As water levels continued to rise, time became a critical factor. After extensive discussions and evaluations, one plan involved teaching the boys to dive and swim through the flooded passages. However, this posed a significant risk. The cave was filled with narrow sections, strong currents, and unpredictable obstacles. It quickly became evident that the boys' safety was paramount, and an alternative approach was necessary. Dr. Richard Harry Harris, an Australian anesthesiologist and cave diving expert, joined the rescue team. He understood the complexities of both cave diving and the physiological effects of sedatives. Dr. Harris proposed a daring plan: to sedate the boys during their extraction to prevent them from panicking in the water. This idea was met with both hope and skepticism, as the plan hinged on successfully administering the right dosage and ensuring the boys could be safely transported through the submerged passages. The team meticulously developed a sedation protocol using ketamine, which could keep the boys unconscious for several hours while providing sufficient safety measures. However, the potential for complications was significant. If a mask were to slip or malfunction, or if a boy were to wake up in the middle of the dive, the consequences could be fatal. Yet, the urgency of the situation left little room for alternative solutions. On July 8th, the rescue operation commenced. Each boy was carefully prepared in the cave, where Dr. Harris administered the sedative. The full-face diving masks, custom-made for each child, were then fitted securely over their faces. These masks were designed to create a seal that would provide positive air pressure, preventing water from leaking in. With the divers strapped to their charges, a careful orchestrated sequence of events unfolded. The rescue team included some of the world's best cave divers who were intimately familiar with the winding and complex layout of Tham Luang Cave. They had trained extensively for such an operation, and every detail was critical. Each boy was tethered to a lead diver who guided them through the flooded sections. They navigated tight choke points, dark underwater passages, and areas where visibility was virtually non-existent. The divers had to be extremely cautious, ensuring that the boys remained calm and secured throughout the journey. As the boys were transported through the cave, the team faced numerous obstacles. There were sections where divers had to hold their breath and swim underwater, navigating through narrow crevices while managing the unconscious boys. The lead divers communicated through hand signals, constantly checking on the boys to ensure they were stable and secure. For each underwater passage, the divers needed to work together seamlessly to maintain the safety of the children. The first day of the rescue saw 4 boys successfully extracted. They were rushed to the hospital, where medical teams were ready to treat them for exhaustion, dehydration, and minor injuries. Despite their harrowing ordeal, their spirits remained surprisingly high. As the rescuers brought each boy to safety, the cheers and relief echoed throughout the rescue base camp, igniting a sense of hope among the anxious families waiting outside. The following day, the rescue continued. Another group of 4 boys was brought out, each facing the same challenges as their predecessors. The rescue team had adjusted their approach, refining their techniques based on the previous day's experiences. They were determined to ensure the safety of every boy, knowing that time was of the essence. On July 10th, the final phase of the rescue began. The remaining 4 boys and their coach, Ekapol Chantawong, were prepared for their extraction. The rescue team knew that every second counted, and the logistics of safely transporting the remaining group were critical. The boys were given additional sedatives, and the divers prepared for the final underwater trek through the cave's labyrinth. As the divers navigated the last stretch of the flooded cave, tensions ran high. With every movement, the stakes escalated. Rescuers worked tirelessly to maintain their focus, ensuring the boys remained secure and safe as they maneuvered through the final obstacles. After several hours of intense work, the last group emerged from the cave. They were met with cheers, tears, and a profound sense of relief from the rescuers and families alike. While the successful extraction of all 12 boys and their coach was celebrated as a remarkable achievement, the operation came with its own tragedies. Tragically, 2 Thai Navy SEALs lost their lives during the mission. Saman Kunan died while on a supply mission within the cave, and Beirut Pakbara later succumbed to a blood infection. Their bravery and sacrifice highlighted the extreme dangers associated with cave diving and rescue operations. The Thai Cave Rescue Operation remains one of the most extraordinary and daring rescues in modern history. It demonstrated the power of international collaboration, where divers and rescuers from around the globe came together, united by a common goal. The rescue showcased human resilience and the lengths people will go to protect one another, reminding us of the strength of the human spirit in the face of adversity. After their rescue, the boys underwent a period of recovery in the hospital. They were treated for dehydration, exhaustion, and psychological distress from their harrowing experience. However, the world was captivated by their story of survival and the incredible bravery of those who worked tirelessly to bring them home. The boys emerged not just as survivors, but as symbols of hope, resilience, and the power of community. Despite the complexity of the mission, all 12 boys and their coach were rescued safely. The operation, which involved over 90 divers from around the world, as well as thousands of volunteers and military personnel, was hailed as a monumental success. The Thai Cave Rescue remains one of the most incredible and daring rescue operations in modern history, showcasing international cooperation, bravery, and ingenuity in the face of seemingly impossible odds.